Is there a point in setting a target for electricity storage?
Yeah, is there value in a target? I think there's a value in an aspiration. We have a target for renewables, so one might argue we should have a target for a level of flexibility, but I understand the desire not to back a particular horse if you're from a policy or a government perspective. But I think if you have a view of if you accept that storage is a part of the mix that we need in the future, and if you have a view of a scale that it will need to play alongside other technologies and services, then you need to have some view of where you need to be at different stepping stones in time along the way. Whether that needs to be a hard-coded legislative target or whether it's something in the minds of policymakers when they're making decisions about innovation support or market mechanisms, or it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer. I would be reluctant to say we must hit 2 gigawatts. I'd rather set the ground rules and the landscape in a way that you could get to 3 or 4 gigawatts, but make it possible rather than impossible.
Thanks, and just to introduce myself, I'm Jonathan Ratcliffe. I work for the University of Birmingham and Centre for Low Carbon Futures, and before that I worked for the Energy Research Partnership, where we did a lot of work on energy storage. And I think this really it hits at the heart of what the community, a lot of who is gathered here today, has to do. And I think, like Mike, I'm not as convinced that there needs to be a specific target, because I think it's unlikely that that will be picked up by government, at least at this early stage. I think there needs to be a process in which we look to the longer term and understand where storage is going to add value or is going to make the energy system more efficient, given the amount of renewables that we're expecting to have, and try and understand that for storage to be part of the mix over the next 15 to 20 years, there have to be incentives to bring it forward in the short term. So that value has got to be brought forward. And we can do this by a process, a fairly objective and analytical process to show what needs to be done by when. There'll be a role for informing the markets or the market structure, developing policy that can enable storage to be part of the mix. Think about business models, what sort of commercial organisations will be able to make money out of this technology, or how current ones need to adapt, so that we can lay out some of the challenges and barriers and what we need to do to put in process the sort of mechanisms to overcome those. So I think that's the starting point. And I think from this meeting, it'd be really valuable, as Anthony was saying before lunch, is to, I think, get buy-in from the wider group of stakeholders we have, from policy and industry and others, to start to form that sort of view that we can take forward and present.
I think all metrics around storage are really, really helpful to developers. I'll give you an example. When we're fundraising, and particularly as we go into the next phase where we're going to have to raise probably about £140 million, the concern of most people who are going to put that money up is surely First Hydro are just going to swamp you out of the market. And you can go down many blind alleys and waste several days explaining that actually we are not competing with First Hydro, that we're in a marketplace that needs to at least double in size just for the services that pumped hydro provides. So the more independent state-type metrics that come out, the easier it is for developers to get their projects funded. So I'll give you an example. In Portugal, I believe they've got a metric from the government that for every 3.5 megawatts of wind that is added, they should be adding a megawatt of storage. So simple metrics like that, which everybody accepts, just makes the whole investment community a lot more comfortable in moving to this new asset class.
I think on my own view, I think rather than a target for energy storage, there is a requirement for us to understand the benefits it can bring, which we're currently doing through a number of innovation projects across all DNOs to understand what the benefits are, how it can be realised, how it can operate and improve our network. But then we probably need to start looking at what's the target OPEX, CAPEX and reliability states that we need, and then compare them to their conventional network reinforcement, so what you're competing against. Because ultimately, if you know what that is and you can get below then it will facilitate energy storage. Without that, it makes it very difficult of knowing what the goalposts are. And in some instances, it will be quite high because the conventional options are very difficult, very expensive, very time-consuming. And for other areas, conventional reinforcement or other smart solutions will be the solution because it will be more effective. But I think that's what we really ought to do as an industry, is understand what those levels are, which would give you more understanding as to how much storage could be installed.
Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, it's Andrew Ryan from Ofgem. Main focus is markets, wholesale level, but obviously I have an interest in networks and the interaction. Obviously, Ofgem, its focus is lowest cost. It doesn't pick technology solutions. Winners. It tries to make sure the markets work efficiently so that the lowest cost is delivered to the consumer. Obviously, as my colleague Dora has alluded to before, then we are aware of some of the barriers to the deployment of storage and at a network level, and the Smarter Grids Forum is looking at these issues in detail, and the issues such as the ability of the DNOs to trade electricity and whatever, and we're aware of that. At the wholesale level, we're obviously aware of the ability of, or the inability of storage providers to play in both markets, the network market and the wholesale energy market. And there are forums in the markets division, such as the Future Trading Arrangements Forum, which is looking at the complexity of how do we achieve and how encourage cheap, flexible generation, whether that's storage, CCGTs, interconnection or DSR. And we're more than willing to explore how to break down barriers for storage and work with the industry to encourage storage. But as I said before, it's difficult for Ofgem to pick or have any bias to a particular technology solution or bias towards the lowest cost. And I'm quite happy to work with the industry to explore what it is that's a barrier to entry for the different types of storage.
Well, I'm not hearing huge enthusiasm for rigid targets, but what about the audience? Anybody want to comment on this one?
Thank you. Paul Wilson, Parsons Brinkerhoff. We've done quite a number of studies relating to generation costs for DEC and others. I'd like to make an observation that if you consider the context not of the capacity mechanism but of other elements of EMR, DEC are effectively setting target ranges for particular low carbon technologies in the marketplace. They're saying that they expect a certain amount of offshore wind, this to that, a certain amount of biomass combustion of one kind or another. And it seemed to me that logically there should be a similar position for storage. Now, I think one of the things I'm hearing, not being a deep storage community member, is that there are different elements or aspects of storage, that the distributed storage has different characteristics and has different needs that may be quite local, whereas the bulk storage has a different profile, a different opportunity. And I think it may be that one has to consider carefully whether the target should actually be a target for large-scale storage versus distributed storage. And it may be we can only have a target for the large scale, but an ambition to maximise the benefits from the smaller scale. So it seemed to me that there's a proper sharing out of benefits needed here to ensure that the payment stream follows the benefits achieved to the consumer ultimately, that the revenues associated with saving capacity in the transmission network and in generation should be acknowledged in terms of some form of CFD, if you want to call it that, for storage. So it seems to me there's a mechanism that could be done that would connect to a target.
Andrew Jones from S&C. I'm actually going to follow on to that point because I was going to make a different one, but I think it makes sense. It's quite interesting in terms of what we're seeing elsewhere. So it's interesting, DEC saying they're not picking winners, and I think as various people will argue that they've already picked renewable winners. But be interested to see what the view is that the Italian regulator has stepped in and given the Italian operators a 2% additional earnings by the fact that they're going to solve transmission constraint problems, because their view is not too far off the UK's view of where it need to be 2050, which is 6 times more assets needed to meet the target, or a better way to do it. And equally, when we hear from California later, we'll find out that's a distribution problem, and they felt for a distribution problem, a target was the only way they were going to get the market to be engaged. So I think, there's different ways, different problems got to solve this, but I'd be interested in what the panel will think of, each of those, can we get there?
Anybody on the panel want to pick up on that particular point?
Well, I think comparing storage with the renewables and how that has gradually become picking specific winners isn't quite right. I think if you look back in the late 90s or early 2000s, the renewables obligation didn't differentiate between different technologies in terms of where the payments were made, and it's been over a process of a decade or so in which the renewables obligation has more or less done its job in terms of driving innovation, and the costs have come down in certain sectors, so that there hasn't been that need for the subsidy in some cases. So it has become narrower, and I think that's the sort of process that storage will need to go through as well, in terms of the market, well, the government not picking storage specifically, but putting in place the incentives that allow it to come through and the costs being driven down. And then eventually, as the technology matures, we might get to a more targets-based stage.
Sorry, just to pick up on that. That feels a bit like a flexibility obligation, doesn't it? And I think a couple of the members of the audience have mentioned different jurisdictions where they've either coupled flexibility with renewable development, or even said, well, maybe the economics for a particular issue don't stack up, but we need it. There isn't another way around this. But the idea maybe of a flexibility obligation, which all sources could play in, and then over time you end up in the same situation where certain technologies or skills or service providers begin to emerge. Why not?
Obviously, it was discussed earlier that there was government targets for other areas, so generation-wise technologies, whether that be electric vehicles, heating, and different scenarios of them. And whilst we heard from a generation developer's point of view that it makes it much harder to secure funding with the ability of the revenues elsewhere, it may also help the storage industry by having more distributed generation. Having more electric vehicles, heat pumps, means that we will get peakier networks. We will get more of a disparity between the big peak for demand and the very lows for generation, which will trigger the need for having smarter solutions like energy storage. So whilst in one sense it may make things more difficult, it may trigger more of a demand for energy storage and may actually intrinsically end up forming some sort of a target.
Thank you. Just to come back on this, the reason that we quite like the idea of saying let's have 2,000 megawatts by 2020 was because it's a lot easier to say we would like to see 2,000 megawatts by 2020 than rather just saying, well, storage would be a good idea. If you ask for something specific, you at least stand a chance of getting a specific answer. Question then is 2,000 megawatts reasonable? And we tried to look at it in terms of Goran's study, which showed that putting 2,000 megawatts of new storage on by 2020 would yield significant savings to the system as a whole. It was deemed to be achievable because it's only, would you say 24 megawatts a month to start off with? So we can do it that way round. And it's a realistic proportion of the new renewable generation going on. So I think as an individual, if I'm sitting up in front of DEC and DEC says, we're never going to ever give you a target, I don't think that stops us asking for it. But it would also be interesting to know whether we've just pitched our target far too low. And I can see that some people are smiling and saying, well, maybe we have. Maybe if storage is doing what it should be doing, we should be asking for a lot more. But be interested to hear from others in the room as to what they think.
I can well see why the electricity storage network will come up with a target, because I mean it's understandable, it's a simple concept, and it gets a message across easily. But that's a very different concept from a government having a target without any policy to actually, deliver that to be done. And I think you have got to be wary of, having a target for a target's sake. I mean, I can hear people being, questioning the renewables target. That makes a great deal of sense. What I don't think makes a great deal of sense is separating it down into technology by technology. I happen to think that's a very unhelpful thing. You want ultimately to get to a situation where markets are effective, where things are cost reflective, and the whole thing will propagate itself in a rational way. Too much target driven stuff and micromanagement of breaking targets down into different sectors, it's okay if you've got a crystal ball, but otherwise it's pretty difficult. So I think for the industry to sort of set a target is a very different concept for asking for a government to set a target when it hasn't actually got any means of delivering it.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. Comparing it with the renewable energy targets, I was intrigued to learn last week that the EU has decided not to set targets for 2030 for renewable energy, while they will, quite different from what they did in the Renewable Energy Directive for 2020, where each country had specific targets. So I don't know, perhaps that's a reaction to targets not delivering. I don't know, but it's an interesting question. Any other thoughts before we move on? Here's a gentleman there.
Hi there, Dave Holmes from Quarry Battery Company. Just quickly on the UK's position on renewable targets of 2030. I actually agree with the UK government that they shouldn't have set a renewable target to 2030, because what they did instead was set an emissions target, and to say that the problem actually is carbon, not and renewable energy is one of the solutions. Let's focus on carbon, and if renewable energy is the solution, it'll win. If it's not, something else will win. So I can see the government's perspective on that. But the previous point about the 2,000 megawatt target that the energy storage network has come up with, I really encourage, and I think that's a great idea that the electricity storage network has done that. But what I think would make it really hot is to give some more reasons as to why the 2,000 megawatts is a good target. What would 2,000 megawatts of storage mean to the UK consumer? And what if it was this type of storage or that type of storage? If we could say 2,000 megawatts of bulk storage will save the UK consumer this much over this time, or 2,000 megawatts of distributed storage might save this much in infrastructural costs, that'd be very powerful and could really get the attention of the politicians. Thank you.
One more back there.
John Prendergast from RES. I think in other markets where we see new storage being built, the regulator has had an important role in changing regulation, either setting targets or changing regulation to support storage business models. But Ofgem doesn't seem to be taking that role in the UK, so I wonder who is going to take that role?
Anybody got anything to say on that?
I mean, it's not being an expert on Ofgem's powers, to be honest. It's difficult to know exactly what Ofgem could do. I would say, to be honest, this is more of a DEC issue than an Ofgem issue. Ofgem doesn't pick technology winners as such. It works within the framework given to us by DEC, by Parliament, is my sort of answer to that. It doesn't, the same way it doesn't ultimately discriminate in the market. It tries to lower prices to the end consumer, whether that's in the wholesale market or the retail market. It doesn't really say we want X gigawatts of CCX, X gigawatts of nuclear or storage or whatever. It doesn't. It's not its role to do that. What it tries to do is to essentially have low breakdown barriers in the wholesale market to facilitate storage, and have the correct price signal for storage, whether that's sharp cash out prices or whatever. It also obviously tries to, at a distribution level, as part of ED1, as part of ET1 and the SO incentives, to encourage the TO and the SO to be incentive and the DNOs to be incentive in how they invest. And hopefully they will encourage, where appropriate, the appropriate levels of storage. And I'd be interested to know what else Ofgem can do in that space, but it's difficult for Ofgem to sort of, we do have slightly different powers given to us compared to, you know, American states or even other regulators in other European member states, but we don't set targets for particular technologies. We do try to get the market to work efficiently and the price signals to be appropriate.
George Day from the Energy Technologies Institute. On the subject of price signals and sending price signals to incentivise storage, one of the things that we haven't heard anything about, I think, and I'm interested in the panel's view on, is the geographic dimension. There must be a geographic aspect to this. You want to incentivise storage in the places where it's going to most on the network, whether that's at transmission level or distribution level. You want to incentivise that where it's going to deliver most value, which implies that you want some sort of geographic differentiation in the price signals. And obviously that's to a great degree, I think, an artifact of the policy around transmission network user system charges and distribution network user system charges, which is very much within Ofgem's remit. So I'm sort of interested in the panel's view about how big a deal that is in terms of incentivising storage. We're thinking about, you know, price signals temporarily being sharp enough, but actually there must be a geographic aspect to this as well. Mike, you know, on your slide where you showed all the various policies that affect whether storage can access the revenues or not, I noticed that, you know, use of system charging wasn't one of them, but I'm interested in whether you think that is something that's significant, and I'm interested in a view from Ofgem, obviously, on that. Thanks.
Locational charging definitely has a role to play. When you look at the transmission level, we've had locational charging for many years, and it was designed to encourage not just generation stations to site in particular places, but with a bit of fingers crossed, maybe some of the major loads to when they're investing in major new sites, to consider whereabouts on the transmission network. There are degrees of locational charging now filtering into the distribution networks. Some of the distributed generators are now seeing. The debate has always been about how far do you go. I have a colleague who believes that every house should have its own short-run marginal cost price, and therefore they would get the most cost-reflective signal of the use of their energy on the network. I mean, to me, that's too extreme even for me. But there is certainly a good case. If you want to encourage behaviour, you've got to, at some point, reveal the costs of behaviour to incentivise it. So just like if you believe in balance is important and you need marginal cost pricing to encourage people to balance, or to at least invest in flexibility to help balance overall, you have to start thinking about how do we encourage consumers at a lower level, a more local level, to perhaps be more active, whether that's demand side or storage, embedded storage or whatever. But I think, you know, charging has a key role to play in changing behaviour. But it's always very sensitive when you start talking about the end consumer, and the whole fuel poverty, socialisation. You know, is it a guaranteed right to energy, and all this debate?
Yeah. Hi. As regards to locational signals and incentives, obviously at the transmission level, then, as Mike was saying, there is locational pricing, and there is ultimately an ability for National Grid as SO to essentially enter into locational contracts in order to balance the system efficiently and economically. So that hopefully there is scope there to encourage storage where appropriate. As we understand it, there's little barriers to entry for National Grid to essentially provide a signal to at an SO level to where they see value from storage or other forms of demand locating particular locations. Obviously, at the distribution level, then yes, obviously speaking on behalf of my colleague Dora, then there is as part of the ED1 process, the price control process, the distribution companies then Ofgem will be exploring the signals and the incentives on the DNOs to use storage and other forms of investment as an alternative to conventional investment, and the degree to which that is how localised that is. I'm not an expert on the exact locational price signals within the distribution network, but Ofgem is aware of this issue about how to provide. And obviously there have been many studies done by DEC and other people on the Carbon Trust on the locational value of storage being highly dispersed, and the value of having that locational signal. At other times, people value simplicity, and at times a complicated market may not provide that signal that gets too complicated and too dynamic. So there's a degree of trade-off. But yes, Ofgem is aware of that, and providing the right signals at a distribution level and a transmission level is something that we're very keen to do in order to provide the right form of investment in the right place.
Sorry, if I may just add one more point. Charging is probably the most complex area I've ever worked in networks over 25 years. And it's going to get ever more complex. We talk about time of use tariffs, but in a world where your wholesale peak price could be at 3 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the evening, depending on what the wind's doing and the sun's doing, and your ability to put in place simple static time of use tariffs is going to erode dramatically. And then to pick up on Philip's point, there's different people wanting to use the same flexibility resources in different situations. So what happens when a distribution company wants to signal a consumer to move their demand from 5 o'clock in the evening to 3 o'clock in the morning because it helps reduce the load on their network, and at the same time a supplier is saying, actually I'd rather you moved it from 3 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the evening because the prices in the market are saying that's what you should be doing. So there's actually a very important coordination piece which Philip touched on, which I think the sector as a whole is going to have to grapple with. And I know some of the low carbon network funds are looking at it perhaps more from a demand side coordination perspective, but there is a genuine complexity of how do you coordinate the use of flexible resources which can be used for different purposes but may create situations that otherwise would have been avoided if they hadn't been used at all.
I mean, I'm no expert in distribution charging, but I believe there already is signals for half-hourly large HV customers which have red, amber, greens into them, so the distribution use of system charge changes during those times in order to move people's demand away from that and to reward them for doing so. I think one of the issues that we found in other innovation projects we've looked at is often the supplier doesn't show that to the customer, because obviously our access to the customer is through the supplier's bills. So if they just absorb that and put it into one number and just call it DUOS charges, it makes it very difficult. But ultimately at the moment I believe it already exists, and it is a reasonable difference between the green and the red times in order to incentivise on the most constrained networks people away from those periods.